there's a way in which play can help us with that question of, well, what is it to be well? And for things to go well, you need to break your own habits. You need to challenge those habits and step outside of your comfort zone sometimes when you feel safe to do so. That's where you get to grow, to develop. It connects very much with the literature on active learning and play in learning, where there's this idea that what children are doing when they play is seeking out this sweet spot where things are not too difficult or too complex so that the children don't understand what's going on, but nor are they so simple that the children have nothing to learn. We kind of lose this curious openness over the course of our development that we start out with as children. That gets lost as we become adults. And we get this idea that, well, we need to be serious. There's this constant falling back on habitual ways of engaging with the world at the expense of more openness, curiosity, exploration. So I can say cliche things about love, but I don't think that's very interesting for your listeners.
If you really believe them, it is.
This is how I would answer your question. Love is an experience of transcendence towards others, towards the world, towards nature. And so there's a kind of self-transcendence that comes along with a feeling of love, a movement beyond yourself towards the other. You're open to awe and wonder. You're open to a fresh appreciation of what would normally be just seen as familiar and mundane and everyday.
Hello everyone, welcome to Love and Philosophy. This is Andrea Hiott. Today I'm talking to Julian Kiverstein. He is a senior researcher in the psychiatry department at Amsterdam University Medical Center. He writes a lot about phenomenology, embodied cognition, active inference, predictive processing. You might have heard of his book, Extended Consciousness in Predictive Processing, A Third Wave. He co-authored that with Michael Kirchhoff. And today we are going to talk about play, which is a very important word for so many reasons. Surprise, uncertainty, certainty, meaning, flourishing. There's a lot of things in this conversation. I did it when I was traveling, and I'm a bit discombobulated. If you watch the video, you'll see I'm in sort of a makeshift kitchen environment. And something about being off balance, I think, actually helped us go to some new places. Took a bit of time. The first part is going to make people happy who want to hear about Carl Friston and active inference and predictive processing. And the second half, we go into more personal things or creative ideas. We talk about a museum called El Echo, which I should name here. It's a museum in Mexico City. We'll talk about 4 papers towards understanding play, its relation to active inference, which I've already mentioned. This conversation with Julian I had a while ago. It's been maybe half a year or more. And I had talked with Carl Friston not too long before Julian and I talked. So there's a lot of references in here to Carl. You don't need to listen to that conversation, but I just want you to know if you hear Carl, that's who we're talking about. Also, these kind of big terms, if you haven't heard them before: active inference, free energy principle, predictive processing. Just think of it as referring to a theory about living systems, which it proposes that we sort of minimize uncertainty about our sensory inputs by exploring, interacting with the environment. And we have an internal model of the world, so to speak, and that can all be controversial. This whole internal model thing, you've probably heard me talk about quite a lot here. But the point is just to think of it as this minimizing surprise, because actually surprise has a lot to do with play, as you'll hear in this conversation, and how we deal with uncertainty, how it develops throughout our lives, how our lives develop through play to some extent. Julian has written quite some papers about active inference, and he has a different take on it than Carl, so you will hear us talk about that a little bit here. He's coming out of more the ecological psychology side of things. If you remember my conversation with Harry Heft, we talked about ecological psychology and this term affordances, which doesn't mean they're good or bad. It's just opportunities for behavior in the environment. Again, you don't need to listen to all those episodes before now, but there are a lot of threads that come from many of the other discussions I've had. And I also want to mention the Active Inference Institute, which I've worked with, and there's a video there between Darius, who did quite some interesting conversations relative to active inference with many different people, and he did one with Julian. So if you want to go into the really detailed, nerdy side of active inference and Julian's writing about it and phenomenology, then I will suggest that conversation and I will link to it for you. This conversation is a little bit lighter. It definitely gets lighter about halfway through, and we start really talking about how these ideas relate to academia, to our everyday life, to where we are right now in a lot of different ways. One thing I want to mention here is that we talk about safety and this space of safety that is necessary for play. I think that's an interesting idea that we think about here when we talk about playfulness, and that playfulness is actually a driving force of creation, also of survival. It's important for us even when we're adults. And what does that mean, especially within the realms and the walls of work and academia? So how do we have both of those at once? How do we not get stuck in attractor states? I think it was Tom and I talked about attractors a bit, and Julian and I talk about it here through more of a medical or psychiatric lens of these attractors that we sort of get stuck in. Think of it as sort of looping around and around in the same patterns or habits. And sometimes play, disruption, which is a part of play, can, jolt us out of that, zap us into another place. I wonder about this idea of play, especially in the tech world, what it really means these days. And there's a lot of change going on, obviously. And in that context, this conversation makes even more sense and feels even deeper today in this moment. What does it mean for us to work together? How do we find meaning in those spaces, those workspaces? How do we find sensual ways of being alive, helping one another, getting through? You'll also hear Julian talk about how he was really influenced by another guest that was on here, Evan Thompson. So another thread. We even get to a question about love and how it relates to all of this. Surprise, surprise, it comes at the end. So today, wherever you are, whatever space you're in, I hope you find a little time to play. Hope you make some space. Hope someone helps you hold that space, or you find a way to hold it for yourself, or you find someone to help hold the space for. And just do something that lifts your spirit. Feel a little free in your body, as your body, in the world. Just dance around. We can all do that. Find a song you like or you used to like and listen to it and dance around. Don't worry if you feel silly. That's part of it. And if you sit with the silliness or you let yourself go into it a little bit, you might actually find something strange and delightful happens. All right, here we go. Okay, Julian, so just to start, how did you get into studying mind and why play?
Yeah, so how did I get into doing all of these very different things about the mind from the Varela Thompson and Roche embodied mind? This is what I discovered as an undergraduate in the 1990s. I came across this amazing book, The Embodied Mind, and it was giving me a way of thinking about how to bring together mind, body, and human experience. And as an undergraduate, that was something that was fascinating me. I was puzzled by. And here was a book that managed to tie together cognitive science, Buddhist philosophy, phenomenology, and show how to connect those very different traditions to address this question of how to bring together mind, body, and experience, consciousness, and how to fit that into the physical world. And I was interested in Buddhism as well. I hadn't really encountered phenomenology yet. But then I read this book and it was bringing together, it was addressing the questions of how to fit human experience into a scientific understanding of the world, but doing that in a way that also connected to Buddhism. So I found that very inspiring. And all of my work, I should say, is collaborative. So I love to work with other people, and I find that I can write at my best when I'm in dialogue with others. And so a lot of my best papers, the ones I'm most proud of, are ones that I've co-authored with other people. And somebody that I've found very inspiring to work with is Mark Miller, who is based at the University of Toronto. And with Mark, we've been exploring like the dark side of mental life by looking at major depression, addiction, and at obsessive compulsive disorder with my colleagues here in Amsterdam. I work in a psychiatry department, so We've been thinking a lot about how to make sense of mental illness, the experience of mental illness, and what's happening neurobiologically. And the predictive processing free energy ideas, as you were exploring with Carl as well, actually, in relation to schizophrenia, are very helpful for providing a framework that can integrate the biological processes, the psychological processes, and also the phenomenological side to mental illness. It provides us with formal tools that really allow us to bring together these otherwise difficult to integrate strands of what is a very complex phenomena. So then we started to think, well, could you flip this around and start to think about how things can go well for a person? So not only thinking about how predictive processing can lead to people having what we call a suboptimal grip on the world, but what would it be for predictive processing to be able to model human flourishing, or people who are happy, people who feel like they're satisfied with their lives? So that's like the big question that we had. Could you use predictive processing both to understand mental illness, but also to understand subjective well-being, or when things go well for a person in their life? And yeah, that's what then led us to think, well, maybe there's a way in which play can help us with that question of, well, what is it to be well and for things to go well?
And when you were looking, in both those cases, when you're looking at something that we've called mental illness, what do you think you're doing with the FEP, or with the free energy principle, or with active inference? Are you trying to notice patterns? Are you trying to find a way to externally communicate about what you're noticing in these? Like, how would you describe that to someone who doesn't really understand? Basically, what I'm asking you is, what is modeling? What do you think of that as?
There's two ways I want to answer that question. The first is to go back to Francisco Varela again. He had this idea of creating what he called a circulation between different ways of knowing the mind, between a third person way of knowing the mind, which is what we arrive at through doing science, through mathematics, through, in his case, dynamical systems theory, which is what he was using to formally understand how the brain works. And then this first person subjective experience that we have of being embodied creatures in the world. We have these different ways of knowing, different perspectives, and we need, I think the challenge in cognitive science, as I see it, one that you see beautifully articulated in the embodied mind, is to create this circulation between these different ways of knowing. There's lots to say about that circulation, but what the free energy principle does is give us some formal tools, I think, for creating generative passages, as Varela called them, between our lived experience and our neurophysiological and neurobiological processes. So mathematics gives us this kind of neutral vocabulary with which to create this circulation between these otherwise different ways of knowing.
That's wonderful. And maybe here you should say how your version, or I don't know how to say that, but your take on free energy and this is a little bit different, or is illuminating something in a way that people have found very helpful. There's this debate, right, of realism versus instrumentalism, or something like that, where we think we can either describe the world or we can predict it. And somehow there's this way you can't be both a realist and just think that theories are tools. And I feel like you've shown, or in your collaborations, that there's another way to think about this. The literal fallacy, I think you and your co-writers call it.
Literalist fallacy.
Literalist
Exactly.
fallacy, yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe you want to, for people who are thinking of active inference in a certain way, what's important about your take on it that you want them to know?
Yeah, so this goes back to the model, the map model, map territory fallacy, how to think about the relationship between the free energy principle, active inference, as a set of modeling tools, and the system, the target system that we're trying to model, which is the embodied creature in the world. So I think the first thing I want to say about that is that it's important to think that the model is an abstraction or an idealization. And so this goes back to your conversation with Evan Thompson recently and the blind spot, that we shouldn't make the mistake of taking what is an abstraction and idealization and mistaking that for reality. And I think you can find places in my writings where perhaps I'm not suitably careful about that. So,
Yeah.
but I think that my meta perspective on this is always to start from human experience as what is concretely real, and then we need to somehow bring that into conversation and dialogue with what we know about our minds from studying them scientifically. So there's different ways of knowing here that we need to bring into dialogue with each other. So what we might do then is, well, give some kind of literal reality to the free energy principle as a model and think, well, if what's being modeled is real, so there really are these processes that are where there's prediction error being computed and there's predictions that are being made top down, and this is really going on in the brain, then there must be this literal computation taking place in the brain. The brain must literally be a computer. And part of what we try to do is we'll say, well, that's one way of being a realist, but we don't think that realism requires that kind of literalism about prediction error minimization or approximation of Bayesian inference. Instead, we can think that the model is giving us formal tools, and those formal tools are mapping out some reality for us scientifically. And so that gives us a way of being a realist about what science is doing. But we don't need to think that the algorithms that are being computed here are ones that neurons or the wetware of the brain is literally implementing. We can think instead that the models are more like fictional realities that allow us to do counterfactual modeling, for instance, of the brain. So they are giving us knowledge of something real, but we don't then need to impute them with literal reality, these kinds of models.
Yep.
What we're trying to do in our philosophy of science work on the free energy principle. That gives us like a middle way, I think, between a very literal understanding of the free energy principle and a purely instrumental one like Innis Hippolyto and Maxwell Ramstead sometimes offer. In your discussion with Carl as well, he tended to use this formulation of, well, it's as if the brain were doing Bayesian inference or were minimizing free energy. And that as if qualifier there is often what encourages people to be instrumentalists. But the philosophy of science literature, I think, allows for a more nuanced position, which is neither literalist nor instrumentalist. So that's what we've been exploring. Michael Petrov has a new book on scientific modeling that is coming out soon with MIT, where he develops this line of argument further. So he's done a lot more thinking on this since we did that work. Yeah, my view is a little bit different from Michael's probably, that I want to be a bit more pragmatist, I think, about scientific models and scientific explanations. So the kind of realism that I would go for would be more about keeping the whole context of the scientific techniques that we're using, the phenomena that are created by the use of those scientific techniques, and being a bit more careful about what realism is exactly, which takes us back to the realism, idealism, and the phenomenological pragmatist ideas that are kind of the foundations for my philosophical worldview, as it were.
What's play? Where did play come in for you, and what comes?
How did we end up with play? Yeah, that's an excellent question. It kind of grew out of our work on predictive processing and active inference. in that literature, you find this idea of epistemic actions. So actions that are for seeking out new information, for resolving uncertainty. And there's an emotional or affective dimension to those sorts of actions as well. I've always been interested in how there's an action component to emotions, but normally we think of that in terms of goal-directed practical actions where, say, you're angry at someone and then you're ready to strike out at them, or if you're afraid, then your readiness is to run away. But epistemic actions also have an emotional dimension to them where it's about curiosity, finding out something new. That's an important dimension of prediction error minimization or active inference. So we started to explore curiosity. And this was happening through work that I've been doing with Mark Miller for a long time about emotions and cognition, where we think of cognition as embodied because of its connection with emotion. And Mark and I started to work on valence. And then Mark Anderson, our colleague in Aarhus University, found our work on valence and thought, this is interesting. It connects very much with the literature on active learning and play in learning, where there's this idea that what children are doing when they play is seeking out this sweet spot where things are not too difficult or too complex so that the children don't understand what's going on, but nor are they so simple that the children have nothing to learn. So the children are always trying to seek out this sweet spot in play. And Mark Anderson started to think, well, maybe we can make sense of why play is fun using our ideas about valence, where the basic idea that we have is that valence comes from error dynamics, so from how error changes over time.
Maybe you can just say what you define valence as. I think a lot of people already know that term, but just in case.
Yeah, so that is an important question, and there's ways of defining valence, like all concepts. But the rough idea is the negative or positive feeling that accompanies an emotion. So it feels horrible to experience fear or sadness. So that's a negatively valenced emotion, whereas happiness or joy, those are positively valenced. So they have a feeling quality that is positive. Mark Anderson saw this connection between his work on play in development and the work that he was doing around just how children actively learn through playful explorations. He saw some links between that work and our work on valence. He thought might enable us to answer this question of, well, why is it fun to play? Why do we enjoy playing?
It's fascinating because you think when people hear active inference and free energy principle and these bigger issues that you're working on, it sounds so in the head, or that you wouldn't necessarily connect it to play. But as it turns out, it's almost a natural place to look at what is being described.
Absolutely. Well, one of the challenges for the free energy principle and active inference is the dark room problem. So why is it that agents don't simply resolve error by hiding away in a dark room where nothing ever happens, nothing ever changes?
Right. If you're just trying to minimize surprise, wouldn't you just put yourself in a place where you're least likely to be surprised?
Yeah. But of course, human beings are very attracted to surprise. We seek it out in all kinds of ways. We enjoy roller coaster rides. We like to go to places that scare us. We enjoy horror movies, and we're thrill seekers. So and thrills often involve surprise. There's a mystery, a puzzle there for anyone that thinks that the fundamental imperative for biological creatures is to avoid surprise or to minimize surprise.
I know it's hard to define play, but what are we talking about really when we're talking about play?
Yeah, well, that is it is something very difficult to define, but we think that creating situations in which agents experience just the right amount of surprise is one of the key features of play. So at least offering a cognitive theory of what play is and how to define play cognitively we would define it in terms of a kind of niche construction, a modification of the environment, where we are creating this surprise that is just of the right complexity for us to manage it, to learn something from it.
Yeah, I think you use Winnicott, this psychotherapist, writer, Donald Winnicott, and I think it's interesting to think of it as with children, because we all understand what it's like to play as a child. And Winnicott has this great idea of the child being able to play in the space of safety that the mother holds. There's this idea of what you just said. There's a sort of niche that's been constructed that's safe. That's a word you talk about in the work too, and relaxed in a sense that you use. And yet at the same time, the child can engage in what feels and is dangerous, surprising, edge work kind of thing. So you have these kind of layers.
So there's a risk. There's always a risk in play, but so you are only going to engage in play in situations where it's safe to do so. And that's one of the things that we see in the animal literature as well. So it's not just humans that play, but also many other creatures. But they only do it when they are confident that there's no danger, there's no predators around, for instance. Yeah.
And that's in part why I brought it up, because there's a sort of thread that maybe we can explore a bit with the play now, because for me, it seems a bit, reading your paper or thinking about it, that this space of play, which is a place where, you talk about as a trusted place or an intimate place, or we already talked about the safe area, is a kind of place that's being held such that people can explore their edges, explore uncertainty, learn from those. That's an important part of your paper, that it's not only that you're pushing yourself to certain edges and courting uncertainty in a way, but you're also watching your own reactions to that. That's sort of part of it, and learning from those. So we have this space that we open for each other. Like in the case of the mother or the father opening that space so the child has it, we also do it for one another at different levels, social levels, and so on. And the others have studied this. Many people have studied something about play is very fundamental to our survival. I don't know if you know Stuart Brown and this Institute of Play in the United States, but there's, well, he's a doctor. Yeah, I think you would like it. But it's another take on this. He worked with Jane Goodall and different people studying animals too, and then also humans, and pretty much showing that we need this to survive. I mean, I'm generalizing. So this space that you're studying and that you're using the free energy principle to study is incredibly rich and important for flourishing, but also for survival. So why is that important? Or what does that give us? And in one of the papers, you talk about how people who play, there's certain sort of ways or characteristics they create within themselves, a certain kind of attention, for example, or attending to the world in a certain way. And of course, behind all that is meaning. What did you feel that was kind of different here about trying to understand those big issues, meaning, flourishing, in relation to play?
It's one of the features of play is that it's intrinsically motivating. So let's just unpack what that means. It's obviously a technical, difficult concept, intrinsic motivation. So part of what we need to do there is understand the intrinsicness of the value of play. So what we mean there is that it's rewarding to us. It's something that we experience positively, not because of the outcomes of play necessarily, but as an activity that's valuable in its own right. So then, one of the puzzles becomes, why would this kind of play activity where there's no obvious goal, no instrumental goal that we're bringing about as the consequence of our behavior, why would that be something that we find pleasurable or enjoy? So that takes us back to curiosity again. There's something that happens in play that is valuable to us because it resolves uncertainty of a certain kind. So the way we make sense of this is to think of the whole kind of process of playing over time, and how under the right conditions of safety, as we already emphasized, children or animals or other agents who are engaging in play will create a kind of situation for themselves where they increase their uncertainty temporarily, and then through the playful activity they find a way of resolving that uncertainty. So there's a kind of error slope here that we can, if we put this in terms of how to model it, that we can use to model this kind of behavior. There's this rise and fall of error. There's a kind of dynamics to the error, and that dynamics is associated with positive valence, we argue, because the agent in the end is able to turn something that is unpredictable initially into a predictable situation that they can then learn from, that they can then control in some way. So it's that process of turning an unpredictable reality into a predictable one that is enjoyable to us, that motivates us. So curiosity is I would say, a motivating experience for many of us, where what we're motivated to do is to gather information that provides some resolution of ignorance or something that we don't know. We resolve that. We're motivated by curiosity to seek out information that will resolve that gap in our knowledge.
Is there something about going through this in a safe space? We're almost going through patterns or exploring new possible connections and regularities, trajectories, I would say, or paths. You talk about that some too. And then does that give us, so if we do that in a playful way, if we were to encounter that in life in other ways, those regularities, would we then have reduced our uncertainty in some way? Or what's going on there? It's almost like courting uncertainty such that we reduce uncertainty.
That's exactly what's happening, yeah. So there is something paradoxical about it. So
Indeed.
you are creating uncertainty, but at the same time, the motivation for doing that is so that you improve your knowledge, you improve your skills. So why is that something that we do? Well, it's, first of all, it's a way to learn, but it's also a way to grow. And now play we can think of as a kind of niche construction where the child is creating around itself situations that allow it to grow in its skills, that allow it to further develop in terms of its understanding of the world and how the world works. Alison Gopnik, a developmental psychologist, she uses active learning models to understand how children develop causal models of the world. But obviously that's a very cognitivistic way of thinking of what the child is doing in cognitive development. And we could equally argue that that in play, children are improving their embodied skills. And so the developmental value of play activities comes from this growth in abilities and skills for engaging with the world, with engaging with the affordances of the world. And what we've been talking about so far is how curiosity is an epistemic emotion that motivates us to gather observations, sample information that will reduce uncertainty. So for Carl, the way to think about what affordances are is that they're opportunities for reducing uncertainty. But we, in our work following ecological psychology, work in a slightly different tradition. So Carl and you were talking a lot about Helmholtz operating in the background of the free energy principle. And so Carl developed these ideas through his conversations with Hinton. And in the background was this idea of unconscious inference. But I come out of a slightly different tradition, the tradition of ecological psychology, where instead of thinking of perception as this outcome of unconscious inferences that the brain is performing, we think of perception instead in terms of this direct coupling with the affordances of the environment. So affordances for us wouldn't be understood in this information theoretic way that Carl was suggesting, but we would instead think of affordances as structures that are directly perceived in the environment. So we think of affordances in a more relational way.
Meaning and flourishing. Those are important for one of the papers in the trilogy.
there's a connection between meaning and affordances, in that Gibson wants to say that the environment for an animal is always a meaningful environment because of what you can do with it, because of the affordances that it offers. So Gibson will describe how we should think of the relationship between the organism and the environment as one of mutuality or reciprocity. So there's a kind of relationality already implied in the notion of environment, in that there would be no environment if there were not animals with a particular form of life that environment surrounds. So what happens when you transform an unpredictable situation into a predictable one is that you improve your grip on the available affordances of your environment. We got on to thinking about meaning in life and well-being by wondering, well, what would it be to have a prediction error minimizing agent that was managing to do this optimally so as to flourish in their life. And there's always a kind of normativity intrinsic to, or value intrinsic to, any behavior of a living being, in that living beings are autopoietic. They're self-maintaining, self-producing in terms of their organization. And that autopoietic process is then their intrinsic source of meaning and value, in that you can now look at some encounter with the world, with the affordances of the world, and ask, is that encounter one that's good or bad for the organism in terms of this value of being self-maintaining, being self-producing? So the classic example of this is the bacteria in the sucrose solution, how that's positively valenced for the bacterium because it's a source of food, so something that can contribute to the ongoing self-production of the organization of the bacteria. Whereas if the bacteria encounters some acid in its environment, then that's something that's bad, that's negatively valenced because it impacts on the autopoiesis in a negative way. We had the idea that the free energy principle gives you a way of modeling formally autopoiesis. This is something that has been criticized, I should say, by Evan Thompson, Ezekiel DePaulo, and Randy Beer in a recent paper. So it's not something that we can simply take for granted, but a lot of the work that's been done by people coming from 4E cognitive science to the free energy principle has been motivated by this idea that the free energy principle gives us a set of formal tools for pursuing this idea of the continuity between life as describing autopoiesis as describing living processes, and cognition. So that idea of a continuity between life and cognition has been a central idea that's been explored by philosophers that are working in what's called 4E, so embodied, embedded, extended, inactive cognition. So just going back a little bit, the idea of norms and values is kind of baked into life because life is autopoiesis. And then we started to think, well, could we then think about a richer notion of value and normativity that might connect to flourishing and well-being, and try to make sense of the norms and values that relate to meaning in life and well-being using these formal tools of the free energy principle? What would that look like if we were to think about in this more subjective way? So not just being an optimal, rational deliberator who maximizes utility or who succeeds in being a good approximator of Bayesian inference, but think of optimality in terms of how well or badly is a life going for a person. And we found that actually the free energy principle can be instructive for thinking about that notion of optimality as well. I can explore that further with you, but maybe you want to pause there because I've been talking for a while.
I would like to know what you found, how it helped you. I would like to know on the level you were already about to explain, but also just if it changed something about your view of play and of these issues in your everyday life.
So theoretically, first of all, what we found was that because of the work that we had done on addiction and depression and OCD, we saw that one of the features of those disorders is that people are intolerant of uncertainty. And so there's a kind of rigidity or inflexibility, psychological inflexibility that characterizes these conditions. So that's very clear in addiction and OCD, which are these disorders that are characterized by these compulsive behaviors. So there's some kind of habits that you see that the person enacts, that they have a strong urge or need to enact in their lives. But you also see this similar kind of rigidity and inflexibility in depression, where people will have this very fixed negative view about themselves and their future, where there's this deep hopelessness and meaninglessness that so their thinking is very shaped by their negative emotions, and there's some fixity or rigidity to the relentlessly negative view perspective on the world. So that's we can think of in terms of this getting stuck in a particular attractor state, so that the way that people with these disorders tend to find to optimally minimize prediction error is by falling back on these habits of thinking in addiction in OCD, but also in depression, that kind of trap them into a particular way of perceiving and acting in the world.
And play disrupts this, right? There's this word
Play
disruptive.
disrupts it, exactly.
Yeah.
So there needs to be something disruptive to get people out of these dysfunctional, suboptimal ways of engaging with the world.
You know, it's interesting. I just mentioned Stuart Brown, and I'm remembering now that as you talk about this, that he has written about, I think the reason he got into play was that he was, as a psychotherapist, brought into a case of someone who was very violent, who did some violent crime. And he realized that they hadn't had any chance to play in their life ever as a child. I think they were also abused and stuff. And he started finding this pattern with a lot of people that they became very rigid in the way that you just described with certain kinds of mental illness. But there was this connection. So yeah, in all these, you're talking about the rigidity, and it's reminding me in the papers you talk a lot. There's playful disruption, and that the space, safe space should have disruptive possibilities. Yeah, how does that come in?
Disruption is very important. The way it comes into it is because what happens in mental illness, we think, or one of the things that happens is that there's this constant falling back on habitual ways of engaging with the world at the expense of more openness, curiosity, exploration. And so that's what I described in terms of an intolerance of uncertainty. That the way that the depressed person, for instance, deals with the adversity that they've encountered is to keep things as certain as possible in their engagement with the world. And so uncertainty becomes something that's deeply aversive. And similarly, in OCD, you can think of the ritualistic behaviors that people engage in as a way of keeping things as certain as possible. Because within those ritualistic behaviors, you can predict what's going to happen. You have good control over what's going to happen.
So are these people able to play
motivation
still?
for that?
Yeah.
Are they able? Are they able to play, or are they motivated to play? No, because play, as we mentioned earlier on, involves the tolerance of uncertainty. It involves taking risks. It involves setting up situations of uncertainty where the uncertainty is manageable enough for you to be able to resolve it eventually over the course of the game that you're playing.
Can we set up safe places for one another? Do you think of this as a practice, as play, as something that could actually be helpful at some level of helping us to avoid certain rigidities that could develop into these kinds of things? Or would you just completely keep those kinds of ideas separate?
I think what you're asking is, well, could play be used in the treatment of people with serious mental illness?
Well, on one
Um,
level, but I'm also
or-
asking, as a society, if we take it more seriously,
mm,
that play is important. For example, as we develop, that we should
mhm,
encourage, you write about cities some and creating safe spaces or places where you can be intimate. And that's not
mhm.
necessarily something all of us experience in our development. So I'm wondering if that could be helpful towards something in terms of the way we develop our patterns
Yeah, I
of how
think
we
it
deal with
definitely could
uncertainty.
be helpful then. So the paper on intimate places that you've been referring to sometimes is about how an artistic space like an art museum or just museums more generally in public places can be places that we go to find some kind of way of regulating our difficult emotions. So they can give us a way of de-stressing, give us a place in which we can find calmness and a place to reflect. And that can be a way of using these places in the environment that are set up for us, these public places to regulate our emotions. So it's an example of what's sometimes called scaffolded affectivity, in that these public places are being used for us to well, they're shaping and sculpting our emotions for us in a positive way, in the example of the art museum.
Yeah, you write about El Eco in Mexico City, which is a wonderful
Mhm.
paper because you sort of walk us through it literally with words and then with
Yeah,
images
yeah.
too. But the images don't come until the end. But so I encourage people to read that as a kind of example.
There's one thing that I think is an important bridge that we didn't cover yet is this dilemma that agents face between exploration of the environment, curious exploration, and exploiting or falling back on what we already know. And so in your discussion with Carl, he talked a lot about keeping your options open and why
Yep.
that's important for free energy minimization. And that connects with this idea of the maximum entropy principle. So just keeping your different ways of interpreting your different hypotheses as uncertain as possible, so that, and only increasing certainty about a particular hypothesis when you have knowledge that gives you reason for doing so. Right? So that's the idea of the maximum entropy principle. It gives you a way of forming these prior beliefs or prior hypotheses. And an important idea there behind that maximum entropy principle is tolerance of uncertainty. So the exploring different hypotheses. And that's something that children are naturally very open to doing. So going back to Alison Gopnik's work again, she shows that children will explore a broad space of different hypotheses in play, and in order to basically improve their understanding of the world. So by being open to different perspectives, open to different hypotheses or ways of understanding the world, that then allows them to develop, to learn, to grow. Whereas as adults, we become, because of our extensive experience, much more prone to stick to our preconceptions, our formed ways of understanding the world. And we'll only explore when we think there's something new to be discovered, but exploration isn't like our default mode. So we kind of lose this curious openness over the course of our development that we start out with as children, that gets lost as we become adults. And we get this idea that, well, we need to be serious, we have to be productive citizens, and our economic uh, institutions, our societal institutions kind of encourage that through making money being one of the main motivators for people. Being a productive member of society, that's something that we're kind of enculturated into, but at the cost of playing, of being open and curious. And so I think you're absolutely right in what you said earlier, that for us as a society, for the collective of human beings to be well, we need to create situations that allow us to be exploratory and to play. And that's one of the things that museums do for us. That's one of the things that art does for us, or fiction, stories, cinema. These are all ways that humans have, because of us being cultural beings, for creating these situations in which we can explore imaginary realities, which we can play.
Yeah, that's what I like about your work too, is I think we want to understand, we want to have models of this, and we want to understand it scientifically and philosophically in the most rigorous ways. But also, even while doing that, you do bring in the art and the museum, and you work with a lot of collaboration. You said that earlier, and it was something I wanted to bring up, because to relate this to play, we've been talking about children playing and the safety of that and the importance of development. But as I've said a couple of times, it doesn't stop with our childhood. We still need it as adults. We still need those safe places. And I hear you saying, okay, that's what books are in a way. A good novel is a space to be safe and try out edge work, uncertainty, look at how you deal with what you're reading. An art museum, do you see it like that too?
Yeah, so one of the questions that arises in thinking about stories and why we enjoy them is always, well, you know that this is not real, what you're engaging with, but still you're motivated to engage with it. And so where does that kind of, what is it that makes it pleasurable for us to engage with fictive realities? And
Yeah, and back to that valence thing that you brought up at the front, and also one reason I wanted you to talk about realism and taking it too literal is there is something real going on when we read something like a novel and identify with it, because we're bringing our regularities to that space, and it's a real space. It's just not real in the sense of that what we're reading really happened necessarily, but I do feel like it's part of how you're trying to describe affordances as abilities and skills, and the way you're talking about it's a relational. We don't really have the language to actually talk about this, but when you go to an art museum and you play in this way, or you read a book, it's very much real in your everyday reality, isn't it? I mean,
definitely, yeah. So, well, one of the things that's real is your embodied reactions to the artwork, or to the fictional reality that you're reading about in a novel. And so we can learn from engaging with fictions and engaging with art, how we're affected by those realities. So why do people like horror films? Well, because they provide this safe space in which we can encounter these most horrific scenarios, which have, of course, hopefully a very low probability of us ever encountering them in our real life, but still, we can learn from engaging with those sorts of scenarios, how our bodies respond to them, what our emotional responses are. But there's also something profoundly disruptive about art and about literature and theater, that you explored beautifully with Alvin Noe, his idea of art as a strange tool, and that what art does, just like philosophy, it gives us this way of putting something on display so that we can then question it, challenge it, break it even, and transform it. And so exploration can be this disruptive process. Play can be this disruptive process. And that's something that is essential to us as to our meaning in life. Why? Well, because questioning, making sense of who we are is a fundamental motivation for us as human beings. And art, philosophy, literature, they provide us with places in which we can engage in that kind of exploration.
Yes, on that note, I wanted to ask you about your collaborations, and so I'm glad you brought it up, because I wonder about, do we have a space for play in academia? Or is that, should it only be the subject that we're studying? Or is there a kind of playfulness? Because to be honest, and what I really love about your writing, your collaborations, is they're often very deep in terms of, there's a lot of substance, but they're easy to read, and they're usually a little bit playful. There's something playful. I get the feeling it's because the interaction that you're having together is a joyful one. Does that ring true on any level?
Yes, definitely. Personally, you asked me how do these ideas come back into my life, and certainly the collaborations that I've been involved with have been always with wonderful people, and they've always been joyful experiences for me. So I'm glad that you see that in our work, and I think that can there be a place for more play in academia? I think there should be more room for play in the classroom, and so it's crucial that we create environments with our students in which they can explore these ideas and not just be thinking about the outcomes and the learning outcomes and what grade are they going to receive at the end of it. And rather, it's necessary for us to set up a situation in which students can take risks, because it's in that way that you just seen that you can be curious, and that can lead to creativity, to finding out something new that you didn't know before. So that's the classroom situation. Then as researchers, is there room for play? Well, because so much of what academics do is pursue these perverse motivations, you're getting a high number of research publications that are in the best journals and winning grants and all of these kinds of incentives that we have in academia. Often, I think that creates exactly the situation that I talked about earlier of there not being room for playfulness anymore. It's just being this serious endeavor where we have to have these successful outcomes. We have to be these successful researchers.
There's that
can be very
rigidity.
narrowing. Yeah. That can exactly lead to this psychological inflexibility. So if academia is to flourish, which it isn't at the moment, I would argue, then we need to create more space to find wonder, awe in what we do through exploration, through play, through creativity. We need to create these opportunities for disruption and not just, well, I don't think that we create the space in which that can happen very often. In art colleges, maybe, but in science, no, typically not. In philosophy, typically not.
That's a very profound, I'm just thinking about, because it relates to so many different things about trying to create a safe space where people feel like they can explore uncertainty. I mean, that's not easy to do, but it kind of circles back to why we need studies about why this is important and what this does, because it gets into how it gets built into what's expected or what's part of what the regularity.
It circles back to meaning in life again and flourishing. And so you were pointing out before that there's a connection with attention and playfulness. And
playful people can attend to the world in a way that's more open and expansive. I think that's a key point in your paper.
That's right. Yeah. So this open, effortless attention allows for a kind of freshness of appreciation, as Maslow, the humanist psychologist, described it. And so this continuous freshness of appreciation. In Zen philosophy, this is described in terms of beginner's mind. So the idea that you know that you don't know, which is also fundamental to Socrates. So as long as you have this attitude that you're a beginner, that everything is uncertain, that creates a space in which you can you can explore, that can create this attitude towards the world where you're open to awe and wonder. You're open to a fresh appreciation of what would normally be just seen as familiar and mundane and everyday. But within that, you can start to see wonder again. You can start to appreciate it again. But that requires this openness, this curiosity, and this exploratory traits and disposition for engaging with the world.
Yes, I wanted to bring up that attention or mindfulness comes in sometimes, or that seems a very important part of this. And also, you said, you don't think academia is working right now, and I would like to hear a little bit about that if you feel like talking about it, because I do feel like the way you described it, we don't really have time for the wonder and the awe of it, which is kind of weird because it's such a portal into wonder education, but it becomes hard because we do get into that rigidity of we're doing this to get to here, to get to here, to get to here, and we have to rack up these certain sort of points. And I wonder how it's been for you too. And you started with Buddhism a little bit. Yeah, I wonder what does all that bring up for you, all those themes?
Yeah. Well, I've been extremely fortunate in my academic trajectory to have encountered along my way many people that have helped me, and I've had a privileged academic by experience of the university, where I've been on a lot of research projects, collaborating with other people. We've been able to create this freedom for ourselves where we are able to play and explore. But that, I have to be honest, is a very privileged situation. So many academics are in a highly precarious situation where they are uncertain in an extremely stressful way. Are they going to be able to sustain their families? Are they going to be able to keep going? And it's a huge struggle for people. And
there's, in your paper, it's about playful people can tolerate more uncertainty or surprise, but so can people in war zones, right? Because they have to. So there's that safe space that we keep talking about is very crucial, right? And that's not often there in academia these days.
No, I think academia is not a safe space for many people, first of all. And the incentives that I've been privileged enough to be able to serve through the people that I've worked with, many people don't have that experience of, and the result of that is that while they love what they're doing, and that's the connection with love, we all are in academia because we love learning and we love teaching. Still, the price that they pay for that can be very heavy and can take a lot from the person. And I think there's a lot of exploitation of vulnerability in academia. So the price of doing what you love is often that you can be taken advantage of. And I see that amongst some of my younger colleagues who are doing philosophy because it's something that is at the core of what's meaningful to them in their lives, but and they will do whatever to carry on doing that because it's so valuable and meaningful to them. But at the same time, their position in academia is very precarious, and that has all kinds of knock-on consequences for their everyday life and their family life. So it can be incredibly hard. So we need to think about how to create an academic system that allows people to flourish and be well. And I think a large part of that will be changing some of the motivations and incentives that the system is organized around at the moment, so that people do have their freedom to explore, to create situations for their students in which their students can experience the wonder and awe of learning, because part of curiosity is that we through coming to engage with what we don't know, we arrive at insights, and those insights are often sources of wonder for us.
I was going to ask you about how you did this, or what do you think has been, is it just luck, or has there been a guiding motivation, or did you learn early on something about yourself or the world that you sought out collaboration, or that you wanted to create this safe space? Because in a way, everything we've been talking about, you've sort of done that in your academic life, which is a very rare thing. Not only you, there's a lot of people that you're connected with, and you do have this space that I don't even know exactly how to describe it. It's not a playground because it's very real.
It's a kind of playground, yeah. We call it a material playground. So in the work that I do with the architects and artists, we see that the spaces that they create as material playgrounds, so playgrounds in which to explore philosophy, but also the possibilities of art. And how have we done that? Well, we've been fortunate to have a lot of support from the Dutch government here, where I'm based, from the European Union. So research grants have kept us going. They've given us the freedom to develop and to grow our philosophical thinking.
Did you also go out of your comfort zone? I mean, did you play in the sense of exploring the edges and noticing how you responded to things? Because a lot of the people you collaborate with, and you yourself, it's very hard to put you into a category or put you into a box, which is also unusual a bit in academia. So does that relate at all to the playground, the material playground?
Yeah. It relates to us being unorthodox, heterodox, yeah, and that's part of being an interdisciplinary researcher, that you're always working at the edge of different disciplines where they meet up. So inevitably, that's unorthodox. What academics do is that they tend to specialize deeply in on particular questions, and then go deeper and deeper into those questions. But the work that I've been doing with my collaborators has always been inspired by this vision of cognitive science as a space where so many different disciplines like linguistics, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, anthropology, philosophy can all meet up. And that vision that people had of cognitive science, I think, is still one that is hugely important and valuable, and we need to try to realize that vision of a space where all of these different disciplines can come together. And I see myself as a philosopher at the end of the day, but a philosopher that is interested in working in all of these other fields as well. And that's something that was the beautiful thing that happened in the 1950s when people invented this field of cognitive science, that there could be a space where all of these different disciplines would be able to meet up. I should say psychiatry and psychotherapy now, because those are also fields that recently I've started to move into. So we have a center that we've just started up in Amsterdam with my good friend and colleague Damian Denise, called the Lemon Tree Center for Psychiatry, Psychotherapy, and Philosophy. So our aim is to bring together those three seemingly distinct traditions, because we think it's necessary to have all three, really, to make any progress in thinking about the mental health crisis and what it is to be mentally ill, but also what it is to be mentally well. We need all three of those perspectives.
Have you found, are you a Buddhist?
I'm a Buddhist. No, I'm certainly inspired by Buddhism and fascinated by it.
Do you have any mindful practices? Like, I think I remember you saying you did Tai Chi or something. Do you have any spaces where you play?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that is a problem in academia is we're so dissociated from our bodies. I certainly found that in my academic experience, that we spend so long sitting and thinking and writing, and those are all great things to do, but they're pretty bad for the body as they don't involve much movement. So I go to Aikido, actually, as a place where
that's what it was.
I find a way to be mindful, but also to move, and also things like Tai Chi and Qigong. I think are also incredibly valuable practices for me as an individual, but I think for everybody really. Everyone can benefit from them. So they are places, practices, traditions where you can find a way to be present in your body, in the movements of your body. Yeah.
Before we go, I want to hear a little bit about how you think about the word love. It doesn't have to be in relation to play. You said a little bit of it, but I mean, it might be going too far to think about all these collaborations, or even when you first read Embodied Mind, this being a thread, love of wisdom, or how does it connect to this motivating, what got you into all this, and what I still feel in a lot of your papers, which is quite playful and joyful, but there's something like what I would think of as love in it on some level, but I wonder how you think about that, or if you've thought about that.
Mhm. Yeah. So, I mean, I can say cliche things about love, but I don't think that's very interesting for your listeners.
If you really believe them, it is.
This is how I would answer your question. I
Okay.
think that love is an experience of transcendence towards others, towards the world, towards nature, and so there's a kind of self-transcendence that comes along with a feeling of love, a movement beyond yourself towards the other, um, and what comes out of that experience of self-transcendence is many things, but certainly the wonder and awe that we have talked about already as something that we become open to through remaining curious. And so for me, there's a deep connection between openness, curiosity, and love, in that I think of the this movement beyond yourself, which is characteristic of openness, as already an attitude towards life, towards the world, where that's characterized by love. Going back to Maslow, we had this, what we talked about as this freshness of appreciation, where you can start to experience wonder in the ordinary, in the familiar. And for me, I think again that's bringing an attitude of love towards the world, towards what you're perceiving, towards your perceived reality. But that's so love, I think, is something that is an attitude, actually. It's a way of being, and that one fosters through creating spaces in which one remains curious and open to exploration. That openness is, for me, characterized by love, because it involves this transcendence of the self, this movement towards otherness.
That's beautiful. I love that movement beyond yourself. In a way, it's what we've been talking about with play. It also reminds me of
It's
something.
exactly what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
With play, yeah. There's a space that we open up in which we can experience love, and yeah.
Oh, that's a good way to say it. So it becomes a space where we can move beyond ourselves, so to speak. A space.
Yes, yeah. When playing with others, we certainly so love involves playfulness, I think.
Even the Winnicott of the mother or the father letting their child play, I think that's kind of an act of love, that space that's held so the child can explore the uncertainty too. That's almost like a literal example of that love being the space. But also it reminds me of other things you've written, and we don't have time to go into it, but about consciousness, of the way that we're always kind of have that beyond ourselves potential. And somehow with wonder and awe, as you've been using those words, there's something with maybe closer to what I was talking about with flow with Carl, or something where there is some space there where we feel ourselves moving beyond ourselves in a way.
Yeah, so they are experiences of flow. In the experiences of flow happen when we achieve moments of insight. John Vervaeke has written a lot about this in his cognitive psychology research about how people experience flow at moments in which they have this feeling of insight, so a feeling of developing or growing in some way. And what comes along with those insights is often an experience of awe and wonder. That there's something that's much bigger than us that we're now engaging with. So that's that self-transcendent moment of opening to something that's larger than us.
Do you feel like in your best academic work and these collaborations that you've experienced that?
Yeah. I relish those moments of insight that you can find with in collaborations. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think it's much harder to reach on your own. But when you're in dialogue, collaboration with others, and working through difficult ideas, then those insights become much easier to access. And I think doing that in a spirit of openness is essential. And so that brings us back to the need for love again, that entering into these collaborations with love is what creates that atmosphere of openness in which we can reach insights together.
And just allowing that orientation to be okay in academia, that to exist. Yeah.
Creating a space for it, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's allowing makes it sound like it can just happen, whereas I think it needs to be an active process that you make happen. There's some agency that's required.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Although I've been, I guess what I was thinking of is there's sometimes situations where it could come, but people block it off out of, that it shouldn't be in that space or something. Or it's embarrassing or no one knows how to deal with it yet because for the reasons we've been talking about, we haven't practiced it or rehearsed it so much.
Yeah, well, that's the disciplinary norms that come along with academia. There's these rigid hierarchies and old rules about how to do things, and those have a function and a purpose, but they are also rigid and interrupting the possibility to create interactions, collaborations where we're free and able to explore and play.
Well, I think one thing just to get from your work and reading you is that is possible and it does lead to good philosophy and science. So maybe just making that explicit is something positive to do for students and people out there to know that that's something to focus on.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can hopefully point the way to possibilities for others as well. Yeah, other affordances for others, create affordances for others.
Absolutely. It's quite exciting if you imagine academia through that lens, what it becomes. There's a way that academia could open to the spirit of that and still be rigorous. Yeah, and maybe these kind of collaborations we've been talking about is a good portal or way of looking at how that might happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, one of the things that we got to in thinking about well-being through the lens of these different ideas of ecological psychology, active inference, inaction. Well, one of the ideas we got to was the need to find the right balance between falling back on what you already know and being held back by that in a way, because it provides a framework for your perceiving and thinking about the world, but it also limits us in certain ways. And being open to be curious and explore and seek out novel experiences that disrupt. So you don't want to go too far in one direction or the other, because if we're always exploring and not relying on what we already know, then we just end up being confused and not understanding or being able to make sense of anything. You need some kind of past or some kind of model or framework to work from to make sense of things. But nor do you want to get stuck in your rigid preconceptions, habits, and expectations for how things are. Because as long as you just settle for that, then you're trapped in these preconceptions and unable to tolerate any uncertainty. And that's what we see in serious mental illness often. So we have to navigate this trade-off between exploring for novelty and exploiting the familiar and what we already know.
It just reminded me, when you talk about that in one of the papers, don't you talk about foraging and farming?
Yeah, so that's in the paper on play, that we make this distinction between foraging and actively sowing seeds that leads to new discoveries, which is the farming metaphor. So we think that play is not just this foraging, which is what happens when we're curious. We seek new information that resolves uncertainty, but the farming is the creation of uncertainty to learn from. And that's what we think happens in play. But there's something that is crucial there also for flourishing and being well, in that we have to be open to that possibility to be surprised. We have to create that in our lives. And that means often being willing to put ourselves into uncertain situations, to take risks, to not just get trapped in our familiar ways of doing things, our habits, but to be willing to break them, to step outside of them, to challenge them. So yeah, that I think is one of the key messages that I take in my own life and from these theoretical ideas that I think could potentially be helpful for your listeners as well, if they're thinking, well, what can all of this philosophical, theoretical stuff help? How can it help me? What can it tell me about how to live well, how to live a good life? And I think one of the things we can learn is that you need to break your own habits. You need to challenge those habits and step outside of your comfort zone sometimes when you feel safe to do so, because that's where you get to grow, to develop. And being well, living meaningfully is in the end about creating these situations in which you can grow and develop.
That's a very good point. I'm glad you added that. It also makes me think of that explore, exploit isn't a dichotomy. That relates a bit to the conversation we were having about academia.
It's not either or, it's both and.
Yes, very good.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's very good. I think you wrapped up some of the open threads there.
Something that was in the back of my mind to come back to.
But I love where we went. That was very beautiful and moving, actually, and I think a message people need to hear. So thank you for that.
That's great. Yeah, and looking forward to all of your future explorations as well. That's great. Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure too. Thanks for doing it. I hope you have a good day there. All right. Yeah. Bye.
Talk soon. Bye-bye.
See you soon. Bye.